I want to get your sense in on the growth theme in China. Of course, there is already the well-documented story that China is going to slow down in 2022. But to what extent and how much will that rebalancing work in terms of eliciting a policy response from the central bank?
It appears at this point in time that Beijing's strategic messaging is about addressing the somewhat challenging macro environment. So if we cast our minds back, we were very much in a hawkish policy environment from the second quarter 2020, and that really hit an inflection point in the third quarter of last year. And since then, both from a monetary as well as a fiscal perspective, you're seeing a bias more towards easing. So from a relative perspective, China is in a very different position versus, let's say, a lot of other markets and economies. And this is likely, from a relative point of view, going to see China outperform both EM as well as developed markets this year.
I do want to get your sense in on what this means for the renminbi, because the trade balances continue to look strong. Exports have continued to look strong. You can say whatever you want to. I mean, you as in general, people can say whatever they want to about the tensions between the U.S. and China, but the world is continuing to demand Chinese goods. And so how does that play into the currency's outlook?
In a very similar sense, when we look at the broad approach from Beijing, it's all about stability, and the currency is no different. So expect a very sort of balanced sort of practice when it comes to the RMB. But from a portfolio perspective, for us, it's still very much tapping into names or beneficiaries of that domestic demand story. And we still expect domestic demand really to drive economic growth in China. And for the emphasis, again, both monetary and fiscally, to be on ensuring that we do see this robust domestic demand story, that we do see a very healthy private sector in order to maintain the growth going forward.
Yeah, and a large part of this is, of course, also private consumption. It's not just about investment, private consumption. On that front, how do you see the risk from the variant, the zero COVID policy kind of impacting the trend?
It is still a risk. So when we look at sort of the retail trends that we have seen in the recovery in retail, there's a lot of sort of negative investor sentiment when it comes to the consumer sector, but the savings rate is still very high in China. We're still seeing that demand playing out, just maybe at a lesser degree, but certainly the risk of lockdowns doesn't just impact the consumption behavior or consumer confidence, but also manufacturing and production. So definitely when we look at the COVID risk, just in terms of policy and the lockdowns, it is something to be mindful of. But then you could also argue that it's very much being priced in to current valuations, especially versus global markets when we look specifically at China multiples.